It's Red Eye Radio. Talk about everything from politics to social issues and news of the day. Whether you're up late or you're just starting your day, welcome to the show. From the Uniden America Studios. For Gary McNamara and Eric Harley, Dan Mandis, this is Red Eye Radio.
It's 866-90 Red Eye, 866-907-3339. I'm on the socials, and a couple of people sent this to me over the last couple of days. It is a great article. It's an opinion piece from the Washington Examiner, and folks were asking me if I had seen it. Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, I spoke about it on my local show in Nashville, Tennessee, but I think it deserves a far bigger audience, which is what we have here on Red Eye Radio. So here's the headline. The whitewashing of Xi Jinping is grotesque. You know, President Xi Jinping out of China. Now, we have had here in the last several days, of course, we had the event in San Francisco. You had the scrubbing down of the city, and you had Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. They're in San Francisco. The two men who, in my opinion, are directly responsible for a lot of the homelessness and a lot of the drug addiction in San Francisco. Well, in my opinion, they should have left all of that homelessness. They should have left all of that addiction right there in the street so that they could see their handiwork. Because you had Xi Jinping, the drugs were made, of course, in China, shipped to Mexico, and then there's manufactured in Mexico and shipped across our southern border via Joe Biden's open border. And so those two men are very much responsible for what happened in San Francisco with the addiction and the homelessness. But this is from the Washington Examiner, written by a guy named Zachary Faria. Those who wonder how the Holocaust was able to happen have received an answer after seeing how much of the world has responded to the Hamas terrorists slaughtering some 1,200 Jewish civilians in Israel. They can see another example with the grotesque whitewashing of and pandering to Chinese dictator Xi Jinping. Now, I could do an hour on both of those, but I'll spare you. But you know what? He's absolutely right. The pandering of this Chinese dictator is appalling. And anyone who knows what he has done to some of the people there in China and what they have done to America, it's infuriating. And then he comes to San Francisco and they clean up the streets, and you had all these people saying, well, wait a minute. San Franciscans have been saying for, years now, that the streets need to be cleaned up. There was a joke in here in Nashville where I was talking about this, and we were speaking about this here locally. And, we had a bunch of people saying, can Xi Jinping come to Nashville? Because we've got a problem here as well. We'd like to get it cleaned up. That was going on all across the country. But remember the run-up to Xi Jinping coming to San Francisco. You had California Governor Gavin Newsom flying off to China to hang out with Xi Jinping in the weeks before APEC, the event I was talking about. Then, of course, again, they cleaned up the streets of San Francisco in the days before his arrival. And then he was greeted on the tarmac. This dictator was greeted on the tarmac in San Francisco by good buddy Gavin Newsom and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, as the article continues, who clapped for him as he walked off of the plane. President Joe Biden praised Xi Jinping because their meetings have always been candid, straightforward, and useful. Can I ask how that is? How have the meetings been useful with Xi Jinping? Because it seems to me like he has not been listening to Joe Biden at all in the last 3 years. And I'm also not saying that past presidents have been particularly effective either, but I think that it is horrifying that any American president, Republican or Democrat, would treat this guy with anything other than utter contempt because we know what he's done. Remember what Joe Biden said about the supposed agreement between he and Xi Jinping on fentanyl.
We're in a situation where we agreed that fentanyl and its precursors will be curbed substantially, and the pill presses. That's a big movement. They're doing that, and by the way, I guess I shouldn't identify where it occurred, but John, I know two people near where I live. Their kids literally, as I said, strange, they woke up dead.
All right. So they woke up dead. By the way, this woke up dead. How do you wake up dead, Joe? That's one thing I would ask. But the part of what Biden said about his friend Xi Jinping and their agreement to keep fentanyl out of America, majority of Americans looked at that, at least the ones that know what the heck's going on, and they call BS on that. You know, in this long and rambling speech that he gave last week, he also said, I shouldn't say where it happened, talking about the two friends that woke up dead. And what I would say to Joe Biden is, it's happening everywhere. It's literally happening everywhere, and it's happening because of you and Xi Jinping.
Again, I hope you don't have any experience with knowing anyone, but this is the largest killer, people in that age category. And,
yeah, all right. Okay. So the big question is, how will all of this be enforced, right? Because Biden says, oh, yeah, me and Xi Jinping, we're on it. We are absolutely on it. Have no worries, Joe Biden leads us to believe. They say that Xi will tell the drug companies in China to simply stop it, says Rahul Gupta, Joe Biden's director of drug policy. I got a BS alert right here for you, friends.
It is important that countries like China step it up. And this agreement is an important part of bringing China into the fray, of making sure that they're stepping it up of their own chemical industry. And in fact, we have information to know that they've just done that right now, which is send a notice to all of their chemical industry to say, basically, cut it out. We're going to enforce the rules and regulations.
Do you know how ridiculous this sounds? Generally speaking, China does these agreements and then they ignore those agreements. Or they find another way around them. And this guy, Gupta, listen to how he admits just that. Listen very closely.
And the last time they did this in 2019, the shipments of fentanyl stopped almost to zero coming, but instead these precursor chemicals began to ship then to Mexico for the production of fentanyl. So we like the fact that China's taken action. We want to work with them as part of the agreement in the counter-narcotics working group, but we want to make sure that we have strategies and policies aligned so we can be effective, not just in the United States, but across the globe. And China needs to demonstrate that as a global leader.
So I think what we need to do is, so everybody in 2024, right before Thanksgiving 2024, let's look at the amount of fentanyl and the amount of deaths and the amount of addicted and where is it coming from. In a year, I want to see where we are. Because he was talking about what happened in 2019 where the Chinese, they said, okay, we will no longer import these drugs into China, from China to America. We'll no longer do that. We'll no longer send your drugs from China to America. So they just, as this guy Gupta just said, they'll just find another way around. And they obviously did. Instead of importing it to America or exporting it to America, then what they decided to do is we'll go ahead then and we'll send those supplies to Mexico and send it across our southern border. The opinion piece in the Washington Examiner, by the way, continues. They say Biden managed to get his precious climate agreement that the Chinese Communist Party will almost certainly ignore. Because that is another thing that they do. They agree to all of these climate accords, and then they just ignore them. It's all about the photo op in the headlines. And then once the media goes home, once the pictures are off the front page, then what happens? They just ignore whatever agreements they have, and they just move forward. And so as Joe Biden stands up and says how much of an honor it is to shake the hand of President Xi Jinping in China, this is the same man responsible for carrying out a genocide in the Uyghurs region there in China. A massive human rights abuse case that includes, wait for it, and this is again from the Washington Examiner, forced labor, which has its ties to China's climate projects that are so prioritized by Democrats and corporations, and forced sterilization. Thousands of Uyghurs have been thrown into concentration camps under Xi's direction, and yet he receives a glowing welcome in the United States from American CEOs, Joe Biden officials, and civilians as well. And yes, Janet Yellen was out there clapping like a seal. Unbelievable. And so when they say, oh yeah, the whitewashing of Xi Jinping, I get what they're saying. They're saying is ignore the deaths, ignore the human rights abuses, ignore all of the things that China has done to try to destroy the United States of America. Ignore all that and let's sit down and break bread. I think they ought to handcuff his ass. They should have thrown him in prison. That's what they should have done to Xi Jinping. I mean, it is incredible the amount of people this guy has killed. Between the Uyghurs and COVID and fentanyl, millions around the world. And I love how people always compare Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler, but the reality is that Joe Biden is the one who is celebrating the guy who is closest to a modern-day Hitler in sheer body count. And, they talk about all of the things that we speak about on talk radio all the time. The fentanyl crisis, courtesy of China, the COVID pandemic. We can talk about that and, where did COVID come from? We know where COVID came from. COVID came from the Wuhan lab in China. And by the way, they're doing all of these investigations into the origins of COVID, and China does not cooperate in any of those investigations. Why? Well, because they know the truth. They're lying about the early stages of COVID. What about the spy balloon that China sent over America? And all of this just scratches the surface. But Joe Biden won't bring up any of those things. He simply won't. And that is a shame. I've got a lot more straight ahead. 866-90-RED-EYE is the phone number. 866-907-3339. Dan Mandis here. This is Red Eye Radio.
This morning's USDA Farm Report is brought to you by Howes Products. Tested, trusted, guaranteed since 1920.
At the White House this week,
We're excited to have our honored guest with us today, Liberty and Bell. This is their day.
it's their lucky day as these two turkeys escaped the oven by receiving pardons from President Biden. Yes, Liberty and Bell.
These birds have a new appreciation of the word, let freedom ring.
Theories vary on which president began this turkey pardoning thing, but Agriculture Department historian Ann Eflin says we do know this.
In 1947, the National Turkey Federation started presenting a live turkey as well as 2 dressed turkeys to the president, and that's been an annual event since then.
Harry Truman would have been president then, but many credit Ronald Reagan with officially starting the turkey pardoning tradition, which continues today.
I hereby pardon Liberty and Bell.
Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Congratulations, birds.
This report brought to you by Cenex Fuels and Lubes.
Lines open for your calls. 866-90-RED-EYE on Red Eye Radio.
Red Eye Radio, 866-90-RED-EYE, 866-907-3339. Just, going over some of this fentanyl conversation. The president today, as a matter of fact, I was talking about what the president did last week with President Xi Jinping, and talking about the little press conference, the little kumbaya, the little walk through the garden, tap dancing through the daisies kind of a thing that Biden did with Xi Jinping, and how people are saying that there has been a whitewashing of Chinese President Xi Jinping. And I would have to agree. And then the president, he comes out and he starts talking about what has been going on across the border. And he did say a few things. Coming up at in the next segment, I'm going to play for you some of what Joe Biden said today, because there's a lot of people that are asking the question, and this is a headline from Red State, did Joe Biden get, they call it hoodwinked. Did Joe Biden get hoodwinked on the situation with fentanyl? Did he get hoodwinked by China? I'm going to tell you right now that he did get hoodwinked. And the problem for the president is that everybody knows that China got the best of him. And so the more that the President Biden sort of drones on and on about some of these things, the more people realize that he got played by President Xi Jinping. And that is exactly what happened. Because one of the things that China does is they will say, yeah, well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and we're going to cooperate. We're going to, we're going to work together in, this big kumbaya kind of a moment. And in reality, they just use that almost like running out the clock, moving the goalposts, that kind of thing. Because I will tell you that the president did get, as we say, hoodwinked on China. And unfortunately, it's going to be we, the American people, who actually suffer the consequences. There's a lot going on, and I will pick up that conversation because there's a couple of sound bites that I want to play for you coming up after the next segment. I don't have time to do it here in the remaining moments of this segment. I do want to let you know that there is a lot going on related to the war between Hamas and Israel. And this is very good news, of course. And the good news is that there has now been a temporary ceasefire that has been called. That is good news. And so there's going to be 50 hostages released by Hamas. Israel is going to stop pounding the living crap out of Gaza. And that's, by the way, what they need to do. And apparently there is a few Americans that are going to be released as well. So, again, that is great news. You know what is interesting? And I was playing the audio from Susan Sarandon earlier where she was saying all kinds of anti-Semitic things. And one of the things I thought was interesting is the fact that you have people like Susan Sarandon. You've got all of these college students across the country and so forth. And they're so lacking in their own context. They are so lacking in their own clarity. And when you hear that you have these college students running around ripping down these signs that people are putting up of some of these Israeli hostages, it boggles my mind that these people who are perpetually blasting Israel see absolutely no problem with taking down these signs of hostages being held by Hamas. I mean, you want to talk about a lack of clarity and context.
Red Eye Radio from the Uniden America Studios. Now, for Gary McNamara and Eric Harley, here is Dan Mandis.
Red Eye Radio, 866-90 Red Eye, 866-907-3339. Okay, the audio bite that I want to play is comical to say the least. This is Joe Biden, and this is from earlier today, and he's talking about the fentanyl crisis here in America. I spent the first part of this hour talking about how Biden said that he and Xi Jinping were, of course, working together to solve the opioid and the fentanyl crisis here in America, which, of course, is laughable. And so then he said this earlier today.
During my meeting with President Xi, we took a critical step of resuming counter-narcotics cooperation between our two countries. It was one of the important things we agreed upon. In 2019, China essentially stopped direct shipments of fentanyl from China to the United States. But in the years since, the drug trade has evolved. It's moved from finished fentanyl to fentanyl components, like chemicals and pill presses, that are shipped with few controls from China to the Western Hemisphere.
Uh-huh.
Chemical cartels use these components to manufacture illegal substances and smuggle them into the United States. So the United States is going to seek to work together with China to target the fentanyl components.
And apparently one of the things that Biden said is that basically he is going to take President Xi Jinping at his word that he is working with his own chemical companies there in China to ensure that those components don't make it to America. You know, here's the thing, and we all understood this. Perhaps Joe Biden does it, but does not. But we all understand that for China to thrive, one of the things that they really try to do is ensure that America is at its weakest point. Because that's what they try to do. They try to make themselves stronger, but they try to make other nations weaker. And that's part of the conversation regarding COVID. And why is it that China didn't warn the rest of the world about COVID? Why is it that they won't cooperate with these investigations from the World Health Organizations and others, including, by the way, America? Why doesn't China cooperate? Because they want America to be weak. They want America to be in the dark. So for Joe Biden to basically take the word of a dictator that he's going to put his best people on it and make sure that these chemicals don't come into America. Got it. Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. There's some other news stories out there this morning. There's a lot going on. And let's talk a little bit about the polling, because everybody knows that the polling for Joe Biden is really bad. I thought this was interesting, though, because while the polling for Joe Biden is not good to say the least, listen to this, because I thought this was interesting. I think that not only is Joe Biden in trouble, but you've got a whole side of the discussion that is also in trouble when it comes to January 6th. We're talking about January 6th earlier. From Rasmussen, how likely is it that undercover government agents helped provoke the Capitol riot? Do you know that 59% of Democrats, according to Rasmussen, 59% of Democrats said that it is likely that the government, the federal agencies, the FBI, had undercover government agents helping to provoke the Capitol riot. 59% of Democrats, 62% of independents, 74% of the GOP, and 65% of all voters believe that the riot was provoked by the federal government. And it's not real surprising, is it? I mean, isn't it? I mean, here's the thing. The more you look at the videos, and we had a nice discussion on this earlier, the more that we see these videos, obviously the Democrats did what the Democrats do during the January 6th hearings, the House hearings. Remember when they cherry-picked a lot of those videos from January 6th? They cherry-pick them to make Donald Trump, and this is what they do, and this is what you do in a court of law anyway, is you try to make your opponent look bad. But the Democrats and Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, they actually hired that highfalutin news producer from ABC to help them tell the story. And they cherry-picked it and edited it, by the way. They edited it as well to make Donald Trump look as bad as they possibly could. And now you have all of this hand-wringing going on the other side of the aisle, saying, oh, it's dangerous for Mike Johnson, House Speaker Mike Johnson, to release these videos. And my question would be, why exactly is it dangerous? I mean, I thought democracy dies in darkness, doesn't it? Doesn't democracy dies in darkness? Isn't that what the Washington Post always says? Yeah, it is. And so for me, I thought the whole thing was really smart for him to release those videos because, and here's some of the things that you see. You see people walking through the Capitol unencumbered. They're not stopping them. They're not arresting them. They're just allowing them to walk through. They allowed them into the Capitol building. And so this whole thing was, and that's not a conspiracy theory, that's a fact. They just allowed them in. Because remember, and I've been saying this for a long time, remember who benefited from January 6th. It wasn't Donald Trump. It certainly wasn't the J6ers. It was the Democrats. Because they were able to politicize it. They knew what was going on. They knew what was coming. Yet Nancy Pelosi didn't order more security. And we saw what we saw. Some people would call it an insurrection. That's what the media calls it. That's what a lot of the Trump haters call it. That's what certainly the Democrats call it, was an insurrection. I will call it a protest that got way out of control, but they were able to bounce Donald Trump off of Twitter and a lot of other people as well. But the big question that everybody wants to know, and it goes back to what we were just talking about. Did the FBI have agents planted inside the Capitol grounds on January 6th? Now, Christopher Wray, I'm going to replay this audio. FBI Director Christopher Wray was asked this question last year.
Did the FBI have confidential human sources embedded within the January 6th protesters on January 6th of 2021?
Well, Congressman, as I'm sure you can appreciate, I have to be very careful about what I can say about when
even now, because that's what you told us 2 years ago.
May I finish? About when we do and do not, and where we have and have not used confidential human sources. But to the extent that there's a suggestion, for example, that the FBI's confidential human sources or FBI employees in some way instigated or orchestrated January 6th, that's categorically false.
Categorically false, he says. Well, I pointed out earlier that there's a lot of times that the FBI has said that something is categorically false. For example, they got those FISA warrants using information on the dirty dossier as the justification to spy on the Trump campaign. Remember that whole thing? Yeah, I sure do. They knew the information in it was suspect, to say the least, but they got the warrants and they renewed the warrants and they did spy on Donald Trump's campaign. Is that categorically false as well, Christopher Wray? How about the FBI colluding with social media companies to remove posts from users who had differing opinions on COVID and lockdowns? Is that categorically false, Christopher Wray? Did the FBI collude with social media companies or not? We all know that they did. Is this the same FBI who reached out to social media companies, those same social media companies warning them about Russian disinformation, setting the table for the denial that Hunter Biden's laptop was real when we know that it is all too real? And, of course, the FBI is part of the DOJ, and they called parents who had an issue with school boards domestic terrorists. So I'm sorry, Christopher Wray, if you'll forgive me for not believing what you're saying regarding the January 6ers, but guess what? The FBI has a very strong history of lying. They know it, and you know it, and I know it.
Did you have confidential human sources dressed as Trump supporters inside the Capitol on January the 6th prior to the doors being opened?
Again, I had to be very careful.
It should be a no.
Yep.
Can you not tell the American people no? We did not have confidential human sources dressed as Trump supporters positioned inside the Capitol.
Gentleman's time has expired.
You should not read anything into my decision not to share information.
Director Wray,
confidential human
gentleman's
sources.
time has expired.
Right. So they wanted to cut him off as quickly as they possibly could. Listen, the American people are not buying it. The American people are clearly not buying it. And so this is certainly, the more of these January 6th tapes that we see, the more fascinating it's going to be. Now, we spoke earlier, and I had some great calls on this, about whether or not it is good for 2024 for the January 6th tapes to be released, because you have some people, even within the Republican Party, who are saying, no, don't release those tapes. It's dangerous, don't you know? Well, here's the deal. Number one, it does drag us right back to January 6th. It does force the Republicans into the conversation about stolen elections yet again. And that means that we are distracted from Joe Biden's epic failures. And so that is one way to look at it. But there's another way to look at it, friends. Because if we can prove that the media has been lying to you all along about January 6th, well, then that is yet another example of how the media has been lying to the American people for a long time about a variety of issues, because this happens over and over and over again. And so I think, at least for me, when we talk about the January 6th tapes, if you are all about transparency, and I certainly am, and I'm also all about free speech, then you want the January 6th tapes released, regardless. Because we lost a lot as conservatives. We lost a lot as Republicans. Thanks to the FBI, and thanks to the Democrats, and thanks to social media, and thanks to the media all working together to try and discredit, and they did for a time until far after the election, to discredit the laptop from hell, Hunter Biden's laptop. So when we talk about stolen elections, my listeners in Nashville know what I mean when I say the stolen election has nothing to do with ballot machines or any voting machines or anything like that. It has to do with that laptop, because a lot of people, well within the margin that Donald Trump lost by, said that they would not have voted for Joe Biden if they knew that laptop story was real. And the FBI took part in that, as did social media, as did the mainstream media as well. And, of course, the Democrats did what the Democrats do. 866-90-RED-EYE is the phone number, 866-907-3339. My name is Dan Mandis. This is Red Eye Radio.
Get in touch with Red Eye Radio, toll free at 866-90-RED-EYE.
$866-90-RED-EYE is the phone number, 866-907-3339. Dan Mandis in for Gary and Eric. They return next Sunday night, Monday morning after the Thanksgiving holiday. My name is Dan Mandis, and I always enjoy filling in. You can find me on the socials at Dan Mandis Show, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter as well, X, and whatever other platforms that are out there. Now, I also host a morning show on Super Talk 99.7 WTN in Nashville, Tennessee, and that begins here in just a few minutes at 6 o'clock Eastern Time. You can listen if you'd like at 997WTN.com. Very quickly, because I'm running out of time, CNN's John King says point blank that the president is in trouble after yet another new poll comes out showing that the president is in trouble, especially with younger voters. And perhaps in places like Michigan, where someone like Rashida Tlaib has been a big-time critic of the president over his handling of the war between Hamas and Israel. Because they feel like, a lot of these younger folks, the younger generation, doesn't feel like President Biden should be supportive of Israel. They feel like the president should be supportive of Hamas, which is stunning. But unfortunately, that's where America is at this point. Have a great Thanksgiving, friends. I appreciate you listening to Red Eye Radio.
This is Red Eye Radio on Westwood One.